Now I would like to invite the Dean of College of Social Sciences, Walt Jacobs, for his opening remarks.
Good morning. Welcome to the 2018 Fall Dean Symposium. We also do one in the spring as well. Usually in the spring we have students present, and in the fall we have faculty present. So thank you. Looking forward to a great event. So as the Dean of the college, I work with all of the faculty throughout the college, but some I work with a little bit more closely than others. So our 4 presenters today, I've all worked with them very closely as they're the newer faculty in the college. So I'm very familiar with their work, and I'm very excited about the work that they do. So as you can see on the flyer, they come from a wide range of departments, wide range of approaches, but they're all excellent researchers. For the students who are here in attendance today, you are very familiar with the excellent teaching that the faculty do. You'll also learn about the excellent research that they do as well, which in turn feeds back into the teaching. So these two things are mutually beneficial. So we're in for a treat with the 4 faculty that we're going to be listening to and talking with today. So next up, I always want to just be brief because we definitely want to get on to hear the stars. Want to invite Pam Stacks to come up. She's the Associate Vice Provost for the Office of Research. So her office provides funding to enable the faculty to do the excellent research that they do. So we definitely want to thank Pam for all the support that her office gives the college and the faculty. Pam.
Thank you, sir. So it turns out that your dean just gave me a promotion. I'm actually an associate vice president. Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Walt. I'll have to come to more of these events more often. And then Shashir stole my line because I was going to say something about being here for the food because it's always been really good. But the real reason to be here today is to expand horizons, and really quite an array of different faculties research today, and I'm really looking forward to it. So as Walt said, the main stage is coming up, but the other thing, though, is that he mentioned that money comes from us. It actually just flows through us. We're just a conduit. And my colleague, Jill Mueller, whom many of you may have worked with, it is our intention to not just provide monetary resources, but if there are questions about working with either the Research Foundation or the Tower Foundation, or thoughts that you have in terms of maybe obstacles that you're encountering as you're going through your research, working with the Institutional Review Board, please feel free to contact us and we'll assist you in any way. But really looking forward to hearing the results of the fruit of 4 of our faculty's labors today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pam. So we have 4 presenters today. Mary Currin-Percival from Political Science, Gordon Douglas from Urban and Regional Planning, Justin Rietz from Economics, and Wendy Rouse from Sociology and Interdisciplinary Social Sciences. So first up, I'd like to invite Dr. Mary Currin-Percival for her presentation. The presentation is titled, How Does Completion of Political Science Research Methods Improve Student Performance in Political Science Courses? And the research question is whether completion of and performance in the Political Science Research Methods courses required as part of SJSU major in political science improves student performance in the Political Science Capstone course, which is the senior seminar. So as you can see, a very specific research question. So I'm very eager to know what Mary found.
Thank you, Shir, and thank you everyone for coming. So this is something that is near and dear to my heart. I teach research methods often, and I'm also a member of our assessment committee. I'm really interested in whether students are learning in the classes that we're teaching. So I love teaching research methods. I am really interested in helping students learn, think like political scientists. Research methods is really important as a class to help students understand other upper division classes. So I also teach classes in American politics, mass political behavior. I really want students to understand when they read original political science research Can they understand election analysis? Can they understand stuff like, for instance, I'm going to work on a project on content analysis. I'm going to do a content analysis of presidential tweets. And so I would really like students to understand when we do work like this and when other political scientists do work like this, don't skip over the methods. Try to understand why political scientists pick a particular type of method and try to understand their actual findings rather than just have us explain their findings, but try to understand it on their own. So research methods helps them understand why political scientists choose a particular type of method and helps them understand their findings. And so in our department, our research methods class is called Political Inquiry. It's Political Science 195A. This is our course description of it. And we recommend that students take it in their junior year. We don't have a prerequisite. We don't require that they take it in their junior year. We don't require that they take it before our capstone course, our senior seminar. But we highly recommend that they take it before this course, because if they take it early, they're going to understand those courses better. And we expect that they will perform in those courses at a much higher level. And until this study, we didn't really know how many students took it before their senior seminar. We didn't know how many students took it before their, or didn't have a systematic study of how many students took it before their upper division courses. So what do we do in 195A? And those of us who teach it, we teach it in a very similar way. There's not a ton of variation. We have core things that we talk about. What is the science of politics? How do you develop research questions? How do you do a literature review? How is theory developed? What are the characteristics of a good hypothesis? What are variables? How do you measure variables? All of these really important things. What are the different types of methods in political science? Those of us who have one that we're really particularly interested in, for instance, I love survey research. I might spend a little bit more time on survey research, but we cover all of them. We all of us who teach it, we all require students develop a research design for an original research project, something that they would be particularly interested in. And then many of us incorporate some type of experiential learning project. So in my classes, we've done surveys, telephone surveys over in the computer-assisted telephone interviewing center in the Applied Research Center. It used to be the Survey and Policy Research Institute. We've participated with Communiversity in community survey projects. This year we worked with Communiversity and the Mineta Transportation Institute and the city of San Jose and worked on the Viva Calle project. So students have this hands-on opportunity to do survey research, to do some type of survey learning. But we're really interested in knowing whether participating in a research methods class helps students in these later courses. And so later on, I'm going to look at whether it helps them in all of their upper division political science classes. But in this case, I wanted to know, does it help them in that senior seminar? Does it help them in that capstone course where everyone's going to do a literature review and everyone's going to do some type of research method? They're going to write a major senior seminar paper. So does taking this research methods course actually help them in that class? And does performing better in the research methods class help them in the senior seminar? Will they perform better in the senior seminar? So those were two of my major research questions. So there was a report back in 1991, the Walke report, that is really kind of our standard for how do you evaluate political science curricula? How do you understand how well your political science program is doing? And one of the recommendations that they made was we really need to encourage students to do more research methods, either in their topical courses or through a scope and methods or a political inquiry class. So they recommended that programs include a class like this. And then the American Political Science Association, one of the major political science organizations, their teaching and learning conference, they recently had a group. It used to be focused on research methods, but now they focus on what's called research literacy. So it kind of reflects this new thinking about research methods, that rather than students becoming experts on a method, become more, think more about becoming broad thinkers about research methods. So don't become an expert on surveys. Instead, try to understand, have a basic understanding of all of the political research methods. So political scientists really want students to become more knowledgeable about research methods in general. So one of the other things I wanted to look at, and this has been looked at before, I'm going to talk a little more about it in just a second, is what is the field doing? What are political science programs doing? How, are they offering research methods, but also are they requiring research methods? And are they requiring research methods as a prerequisite for capstone courses? Because I think we should require it as a prerequisite for a capstone course, but how much is that being done in the field in general? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I looked at that. Previous research, a lot of it is focused on how is the class taught. There's so much research on how is research methods taught. Are experiential learning projects beneficial? Do people focus on peer modeling? What types of books are the best to use in research methods classes? And there's some research on how students perceive these types of courses. Do they perceive them as useful? Do perceptions of usefulness actually affect how much they think they've learned in a particular course? One of the big things people have looked at as how anxious people feel toward this course. Research methods and statistics, of course, really make people very anxious. They get really stressed out about this class. Students avoid research methods. And I can tell you anecdotally, students avoid this class. They don't want to take it. I'm seeing some of my students nod. So they put off taking this class. And part of it is math anxiety. They think there's a lot of math in this class. And so they put off taking it. And students who are really anxious about this class perceive that they've learned less in the course. But people who think that the class is useful are the ones who are going to learn a lot in it. And the class, speaking as somebody who teaches the class is really useful, not just for later political science classes, but just in general. And so students' perceptions about this class and their experiences in the class are super important, just how useful they find the class, how much they're going to learn in the class, and just later experiences in a political science program. So there's all this work on what people think about the class, different ways of teaching the class, how people perform in the class in general. But as far as how does this class affect later learning, there's not a ton of research. These are really the only major studies I could find about this, 2 in psychology and 1 in political science. And so the first one in psychology, Scott Frung and his associates, they did a small study at the University of Wyoming. And so they looked at participation in research methods and statistics and looked at later performance in psychology, so their psychology GPA. And they found that students who took research methods and statistics early in the program and did better in the class had higher psychology GPA. And then a later study using a much larger sample of students, they found that students who did well in research methods, they looked at just research methods, did better in core upper division psychology courses. But the only political science study I've been able to find was actually a pretty innovative study. So they looked at political science research methods, but it wasn't a scope and methods course. They actually had 3 different courses at their university. So it was a topical course that had a pretty strong scope and methods component, and they use it as their scope and methods course. And they looked at students' performance in that class and then how they did in their capstone course, their senior seminar course. And so it's a direct comparison of how they did in a research methods course on how they did in a capstone course, but the research methods courses are taught in different ways. So it's different than what I'm doing. They don't all emphasize the same things in these courses. So I want to know, if you take this course early, so if you take it before your senior seminar, not at the same time as your senior seminar. If you take it early, will you perform better in your senior seminar? And moreover, if you do well in this course, will you perform better in your senior seminar? And so I have a couple of dichotomous level variables. So the independent variable, you took it early, so you took it before your senior seminar, or you took it at the same time. And this is not ideal, in my opinion, taking it at the same time as the senior seminar, and certainly taking it later. We want you to take it early. We want you to learn these skills before you go in. And then also the performance. You got a C+ or better, or you got a C or worse. And then the dependent variable in this was your performance in the senior seminar, and that's just a numerical level grade. So F to A+. And then our senior seminar, people teach, we have all sorts of faculty who teach it, but they all share this common theme of they're going to have a large senior seminar paper, somewhere between 15 and 20 pages, 15 and 20 pages, and there's going to be something resembling a hypothesis, research question, some kind of literature review. It's going to emphasize those skills that you've learned in the in the research methods course. So really quickly, what kinds of things did I learn just from going through the data that I got from the IEA? Surprisingly, a lot of people did take the course, the research methods course, before the senior seminar. So that was wonderful. And most people did well in the course, got at least a C+ in the research methods class. So I only looked at the folks who actually did the senior seminar. So this analysis is only among the people who did the senior seminar. Here are the things I controlled for. So I controlled for income, I controlled for gender, I controlled for whether or not they were a transfer student, I controlled for their lower division GPA, so some measure of their performance as a student overall. What I found was whether they took it first, now granted this is a pretty small data set, whether they took it first was not statistically significant, but their performance in the class was. So if you did well in the methods course, you were going to do better in the senior seminar. And I'm going to talk a little bit, hopefully later in the question and answer session, about I think there's a better way to measure this, about taking it early. But really quickly, I want to talk about what's going on in other courses or in other programs. So my research assistant helped me with this. We took a random sample of 279 programs in the country and looked at what is being offered. A lot of programs. So we based this on the US News and World Report, all of the programs in political science, and we looked at what's being offered, what are the prerequisites, do they offer a capstone course, do they offer research methods, do they require research methods? And we found a great many of them, a large percentage of them actually offer research methods. And of those, a pretty decent amount require research methods. A lot of them require a capstone course, but not a ton of them require research methods as a prereq for the capstone course. But of those, 29% actually have a grade requirement to pass that research methods course. So one of the things that my colleagues and I have been talking about is making research methods a requirement for our capstone course, but also changing the grade requirement to pass research methods. Because right now there is no, you can pass research methods with a D, and in our opinion, research methods should have a higher grade passing threshold, that you should have at least a C to pass research methods, and we appreciate that that could create bottlenecks if we have a grade threshold that's a little higher. Even though I don't have evidence right now to show you that taking it first means they'll perform better in the senior seminar, I'm hoping in the question and answering session that I can give you at least some anecdotal evidence and arguments for ways that we can test it further. We need more data. I'm going to talk more about it later. I know Shashir is saying, hey, you got 1 minute. So, but I would like to talk about this more and other ways to test this. I would like to look at their senior seminar papers. I don't think grade is enough. I would like to look at their senior seminars. Now that I've looked more at this other political science paper, which I actually found just recently, it was kind of hard to find, but I would like to look at their senior seminar papers. I would like to look at what they're doing in the senior seminar papers to test this further. But thank you, guys.
Thank you, Mary. And we will take all the questions and comments towards the end after all the presenters have presented, so please note them down. So next presenter is Dr. Gordon Douglas, so I invite him onto the podium. He's a faculty in the Urban and Regional Planning Department. The title of his presentation is Privilege and Placemaking in the Help Yourself City. So Dr. Douglas started with a question, when local governments neglect public services or community priorities, how do concerned citizens respond? So in this talk, which draws upon his newly published book, The Help Yourself City, he looks closely at people who take urban planning in their own hands with homemade signs and benches, guerrilla bike lanes, and more. So a very fascinating presentation, and I'll invite Dr. Douglas to talk more about it.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Shashir. Thanks, everybody, for inviting me to talk about this. This research comes from my brand new book, The Help Yourself City, which is really about the cultures of contemporary placemaking in highly professionalized cities in what we often call the global north, especially I'm looking at North America. And these cities that have become very regulated, professionalized, urban planning and design environments in which nonetheless people are still making all sorts of unauthorized improvements to their communities, right? And so I'm looking at this idea of urban placemaking in general, which is simply how the built environment is built, both formally and informally. And in particular, I focus on a practice that I call do-it-yourself urban design, and what it can tell us, I think, about opportunities for participation in local planning and placemaking among sort of everyday community members, but also what it has to tell us about the troubling persistence of social inequality and privilege in urban space more generally. So here are some images of the sorts of things that I'm talking about when I talk about DIY urban design. For instance, the sign at the top left is a fairly simple, fairly official-looking cross-traffic does not stop sign that was created by a resident of Pittsburgh in 2010 who noticed that the city had changed the traffic pattern at the intersection near his place of work. And it was leading to some fender benders out there in the intersection, right? So he looked into the city's design standards, went home, mocked something up on his computer, and printed it out on his home vinyl plotter, which he happened to have. And then he put it up at the intersection there. And last time I was in Pittsburgh, just a couple years ago, 7 years after he had put it up, it was still there. I showed a city commissioner who I was hanging out with that it was there. They had no idea. And he, as far as he's concerned, it seems to have actually reduced the amount of glass and stuff in the intersection and maybe is having some sort of positive impact. Other examples include people making homemade street signs and benches, hand-painted crosswalks, bike lanes under cover of darkness, or intersection plazas, converting disused magazine racks or phone booths into things like community book exchanges, or planting gardens in vacant lots and tree wells, right? Guerrilla gardening, things like this. And, you know, I found that in speaking to, I had started this research by looking at a wider array of sort of unauthorized interventions in urban space. My own research background had been in street art and graffiti, and I was interested in sort of squatting and the Reclaim the Streets movement, where people literally like shut down streets and jackhammer into the asphalt to plant trees and things like that. And I started talking to people who were doing something a little different. They didn't fit this kind of classic sociological or criminological understandings of people making unauthorized or illegal interventions into urban space. They weren't doing it primarily as a form of activism or protest. It wasn't primarily a sort of art or sort of communicative, creative expression in that way. And it certainly isn't what you would think of as vandalism or disorder, right? It's about kind of the opposite. It's about making what at least they see as little local improvements. And they see themselves as these just kind of quiet, usually anonymous, and sometimes totally one-off sort of local do-gooders who just see something that needs fixing and decide they have the skills or the knowledge or the resources or whatever it is to fix it. So broadly speaking, do-it-yourself urban designers see themselves as providing a sort of positive, common-sense solution to the problems that they see in their communities. And they tend to respond either to symptoms of neglect and disinvestment, or in other cases, to what we might call overdevelopment and the commodification of public space, right? And so the do-it-yourselfers I interviewed spoke about these sorts of deficiencies in their built environment quite clearly and sometimes very explicitly in terms of sort of uneven development priorities and other policy realities that we might associate with sort of contemporary late 20th century, early 21st century mainstream urban planning and development. Right, and this goes back to the whole context of what we might call the neoliberal city and sort of uneven investment in different places, with a lot of decision making being given over to private actors rather than the state. Right, and they view these kind of deficiencies as sort of calls to action. But I argue they also create a sort of environment in which this sort of stuff is more not only necessary, but in many ways kind of encouraged. And I argue that this sort of DIY urbanism is in many ways part of this kind of neoliberalization of urban space and urban planning, where again, individuals are kind of making all of these decisions rather than the so-called democratic planning process, right? So I found that a lot of do-it-yourselfers bring a great deal of knowledge and skill to their interventions, including in some cases backgrounds and professional training of direct relevance to the sorts of improvements that they make. And they look to official guidelines to try to do things as right as possible. This is a guy named Richard Ankrum who I interviewed. He's an artist and a professional sign maker. And this is an image of the 110 freeway over downtown Los Angeles, which some of you may recall has this kind of nasty hairpin left-hand exit to get onto the 5 North if you're trying to go north from downtown. And he was, like many people in around 2002, tired of getting lost because the signage was so unclear. So he made and installed a new sign himself. And this project of his, this is him up there doing it, was up for 2 years before Caltrans even acknowledged that a change had been made. And even then, a couple years later, when they finally replaced the signs due to kind of routine upgrades along the whole route, they actually kept his design changes in place. I mean, they took down the sign, but they acknowledged that there ought to be a better sign on the left-hand side for the left-hand exit, all this kind of stuff, right? So these things can be really impactful and valuable, right? Another group of do-it-yourselfers I talked to in Los Angeles painted this new bike lane across a bridge using a lane striper that they had purchased at Home Depot, stencils, and this little replica sign that says DIY instead of DOT. And they're really interested in this idea of how to do it right? They've looked into the city's bike plan and all the standards. And as they said, we had to learn about urban design. We had to learn about the best place for a bike lane, right? And I think this is important because it shows how a concerned individual will kind of go out of their way to make an improvement that they see as needed, but also to invest considerable effort in really doing it right. But it also gives us a sense of the sort of people who are doing these interventions, right? And where they come from and what resources they bring to bear. And in this way, I think it's also indicative of a sort of hubris on the part of many do-it-yourselfers. Although they see themselves as these benevolent do-gooders, their backgrounds make them perhaps overly confident in themselves and their actions, raising the concern of them imposing their values and their will on public spaces. And indeed, the priorities that they bring in terms of what projects they want to build or what things they see need to be addressed may not be everyone's priorities, right? And so the question of who's doing these things, and just as crucially who is not, became a central part of my analysis of DIY urbanism, and indeed a sort of broader critique of contemporary creative placemaking practices that I bring in the book. Because I think it's very different to be out there painting a bike lane or removing corporate advertising from public space, as you can see that man named Jordan doing there on the bottom right, or really doing anything unauthorized and potentially attention-getting, whether under cover of darkness or in broad daylight, as some of these folks do. It's really different to be doing that kind of stuff as a young middle-class white man than it is for a person of color, operating under near constant suspicion and threat of violence from authorities, especially while doing sort of transgressive or unexpected things in public space, right? And indeed, for many Black and Latino do-it-yourselfers who I spoke to, these concerns about legality were never far from their minds. And that doesn't mean that people without without this sort of social privilege don't act to improve their communities, Of course, some do, and of course, some sorts of informal urbanism are incredibly common in underprivileged communities. But it certainly disincentivizes this sort of activity, right? Especially attention gathering stuff. Things that might attract attention from the press or be more likely to be sort of viewed positively by authorities, positively by community members, that kind of stuff. And so you begin to see a real sort of division among the people participating and really the ability to freely participate in these kinds of local improvements that we might initially think of as very kind of communitarian and grassroots and open to everybody, right? And so it shapes who's able to participate freely and under what conditions they're able to do so. So the persistence of underlying social inequality in the realities of DIY urbanism, of course, influences then the sorts of projects that are being created and where they're being created, as well as the priorities that they might represent and even the aesthetics that come to dominate in this stuff, which has become a real trend, right? And so when you have these educated, privileged members of the so-called creative class making the bulk of these improvements, it's not surprising that they become quite trendy, celebrated in the press and adopted into more official, professional planning and design practice. And so indeed, we have DIY at the highest levels of design and planning, including things like the 2012 Venice Architecture Biennale, or multi-day festivals like this one at the bottom left here that I was just invited to over the summer, which was full of mayors and policymakers, and really important urbanists from all around Europe and North America and elsewhere. Even developers and things, celebrating this idea of kind of bottom-up grassroots urbanism as something that the city should embrace, as kind of the way forward in new progressive planning, and indeed in economic development and other priorities like that, that as we know sort of tend to dominate mainstream urban policy. And we have these tactics and aesthetics being put to use in mainstream planning, and things like creative placemaking, which some of you may be familiar with. San Jose has embraced quite a bit of it downtown. This idea that we can bring sort of simple, tactical, low-cost approaches to making our public spaces a little bit more human scale, pedestrian-oriented, and things like that. And these all of these are very official interventions. These are city-sponsored efforts being done by local business improvement districts and other groups like that, basically as a way of kind of quickly, cheaply, and creatively making new public spaces out of our streets and sidewalks. And they're doing so in ways that very much reflect the tactics and the aesthetics, and indeed the very projects of DIY urbanism. And so then we even have cases of a sort of direct, formal embrace of DIY urbanism, with particular projects being recognized themselves as good things, and finding a sort of path to official acceptance and adoption. And so it's very easy for something with a creative, spontaneous, or even transgressive spirit, like the first parking day here. This is in San Francisco in 2005, in which a group of Berkeley design students occupied a parking space, fed the meter, and then put a temporary park there, right? This sort of thing, which had its kind of transgressive background, was immediately embraced by the city of San Francisco, right? And now the first Friday in September is Parking Day in San Francisco and many, many other cities around the country. In fact, hundreds of cities around the world. And so these things become trendy, and they get copycatted, and they become embraced into official planning, all the way into the proliferation of these parklets that you can now find in many cities, including our own downtown San Jose, which again take this kind of spirit and this kind of aesthetic, but are usually done outside of businesses, right? And although they may be emphatically public spaces, they don't actually function as such if they're not really welcoming to somebody who doesn't want to buy an espresso or might be pushing a shopping cart or something like that, right? They don't function in the same way as a traditional public space. And so maybe it shouldn't be surprising that even something as seemingly harmless and indeed generous as a bike lane or a guerrilla garden, or this sort of seed bombing effort here, organized by a woman in Brooklyn several years ago, which can become viewed as signs of gentrification and sort of some unwelcome outsider coming into a neighborhood and impressing what they see as priorities onto a neighborhood that may not want to be changed in that way, right? You get these sort of middle-class values and priorities taking precedent. And especially in neighborhoods that are changing rapidly, like so many here in our region and in New York and other places like that, this can be a real problem. It can be viewed as a real threat by longtime community members, right? In most cases, and I'm wrapping up, I think, the fundamental question is not so much whether DIY urbanism or even trendy things like parklets are themselves harmful, because to be sure, these things can be positive and they can be beautiful human-scale places that locals really like and use. The question is whether people's ability to participate in these processes and have their own values and design ideas reflected in the results is equitable. Because these trends also show just how powerful market forces are in even the most generous of grassroots placemaking efforts, and they demonstrate that even informed and well-intentioned individuals can be implicated in these kind of undemocratic development processes. So the point is that we can't embrace these kinds of tactics, as we increasingly are, without a critical eye on the social qualities of the spaces that are resulting, and the processes that produce them, who benefits and who's excluded. And in the book, I conclude by focusing on mobilizing the concept of legitimacy as perhaps a more meaningful way of distinguishing urban space interventions than this question of formality and informality, or legality and illegality, which can be so based on sort of underlying social inequality. And I think that by focusing on an intervention's social and cultural legitimacy, and simply its kind of local appropriateness, that we might get closer to figuring out exactly how to elevate the projects that are most meaningful and appropriate and welcome for a community. And I think that regenerative, community-based placemaking like this can be found in cities all over the United States and beyond, right? So we have to just look for these examples. And finally, this is an architect named Steve Kansian who's helped organize the creation of a bunch of DIY public spaces in underprivileged neighborhoods, mainly in California. And the projects that he organized are explicitly aimed at making local improvements in ways that do not promote gentrification, right? Which is one of the fundamental challenges we're talking about in urban planning and design all the time, is how can we make improvements without displacing the people who ought to benefit from them? And he has a lot of thoughts on this, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, but his solution to the role of architects or anybody with this sort of privilege that they might bring to placemaking is that there's certainly a role for these people, but they just shouldn't be in the lead, right? And he makes the point that if somebody who looks like and earns like the majority of the folks in the neighborhood isn't making these decisions, then we have to just stop and kind of start over and just keep having a conversation. And this is something we're working on with our urban planning students in my urban design studio course and other courses. We're working with Communiversity out in communities where we're trying to do kind of small scale urban design work in a way that might benefit the community. And truth be told, it might end up looking like some of this stuff, right? But if we start with having a conversation and we do our best to make sure we're not just hearing from the most elite interests in the neighborhood. Some of my students figured out that if just by going to the laundromat and talking to the folks in the laundromat, we could get around this problem that we were having where every time we had a community meeting, it was the same homeowners who were showing up, right? But who's not at a laundromat? Homeowners. So we went to the laundromat and we got a whole bunch of different ideas about what people needed in these spaces. So I'm sure I'm pretty much out of time, so I'm going to wrap up. But I think it's important that we do this kind of stuff and bring in the voices of everyday community members and not assume that just because something has this kind of bottom-up grassroots appeal, that it's actually effectively engaging everyday people, especially underprivileged people, any more than the traditional planning process does, because it's real easy to miss out on the voices of the longer-term residents. And yet, I think if we can find a way to elevate those voices, we're going to hear about all the stuff that is so important for mainstream planning and find a new way into introducing people into participation in our placemaking process by learning about the things that people are so interested in and so kind of find so needed in their communities that they're actually willing to do it themselves, which ought to be, exactly the kind of things we're looking for. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Douglas. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Justin Rietz from Economics Department. The title of his presentation is Secondary Currency Acceptance, Experimental Evidence from a Dual Currency Search Model. So Dr. Rietz is motivated by the use of alternative currencies during economic crises. He experimentally tests the acceptance of a secondary currency when a primary currency already circulates, and the underlying model predicts that three things could happen, either total acceptance or a total rejection of the secondary currency or something in between. So I'm very curious to see what Dr. Rietz found.
All right. Thank you, Shashir. Thank you for having me today. Get this. Okay, so I'll just jump right in. Just some definitions up front, somewhat semantics. How do I define money? It's a widely accepted medium of exchange. That's a pretty standard definition. What is a fiat money? The money with exchange value significantly greater than its commodity value. You have a $100 bill. The components of it, the ink and the paper, are worth a lot less than $100. Legal tender is money that's accepted in payment. Typically, we look at taxes or legal debts. And secondary currency, the topic of my research, is often a privately provided medium of exchange that circulates alongside of legal tender money. So probably easier to look at, whoop, I didn't get that full projected. Now my animations will look a little bit better. Okay, so a typical one that is what originally drove my research was Bitcoin. It doesn't fit as nicely into a secondary currency category, but there's a lot of good historical examples. So the British Mint in the 1800s stopped minting small denomination coins. Why? Costs the same to mint a 10 shilling coin as a 1 penny coin. Why mint the cheap ones? Okay, so businesses had a hard time paying their workers. So what did they do? They had private mints illegally mint coins for them to pay their workers. Okay. Another example, during the Great Depression, we had examples where local business associations or local communities would actually create their own money in response to a shortage of US dollars. Likewise, in another economic crisis in Argentina in the early 2000s, local business exchanges created their own money again. Here it's called Argentinian Creditos. Okay, started off as barter exchange, ends up being where they're using these tickets as actually monetary exchange. Happens in Greece in 2015, shortage of euros. So local communities, local business exchanges create their own money. And in fact, in this situation, the Greek government supported it. In response to not having enough euros, the Greek government said, these are great, let these local communities create their own money. The most recent example, probably within the last 6 months, was in Venezuela, a local community currency called the Panal. Somewhat ironically, it has a picture of Hugo Chavez on it, under which the hyperinflation started that caused the need for the currency. So that's sort of a separate research topic. Okay, so my question is, under what conditions are these secondary fiat medium of exchange, let's just call them secondary currencies, accepted when there's already a primary currency in existence? Why are people willing to do this in some situations and not other situations? My primary focus is on the inability to people to barter. You're in Greece, it's 2015, you don't have euros. Why not just barter your shoes for flowers or what you want to get? We see that not happening for some reason. Okay, and like I said, in Greece they theoretically could barter, but they didn't. Or they could drop their prices so that the small amount of euros you had could be used to purchase goods and services. We don't see prices dropping that much. Okay, we don't see this, we're starting to see this in Venezuela. There's not a lot of good on-the-ground data yet. Okay, see, it got mixed up again. Okay, so this is supposed to say, if you can't read it, prediction. My prediction at the beginning of my research, given that people are already used to using money, if you introduce a secondary currency, they're gonna use it, right? We're just naturally used to using money on a day-by-day basis. But as we should know about economists and predictions, the science of evaluating tomorrow, the predictions you made yesterday, if they come true today. So I always hesitate to make predictions. So what do? So I'm going to experimentally test in a controlled laboratory setting the predictions of a dual currency search model. Controlled laboratory setting is basically I take an economic model that models dual currencies or these secondary currencies. I create a computer game out of it. I pay undergraduates to participate in the game. I take the data from their actions or their decisions and see if it matches up with what the model told me they should do. Okay, so this is the ugly mathematical model just to prove that there's actually a model underneath. This is also the point in lectures where usually even economists fall asleep, okay? And people go through their equations and, you know, no one really cares, but it is there. Okay, so the model's predictions are slightly different than my predictions. So under the model, adoption of a secondary currency when barter is allowed, when people can trade goods for goods, basically it says it's going to be very low or go to zero, that people won't barter. So actually the model predicts what would happen in the real world, which I should have maybe taken that into account when I made my original hypothesis. But under no barter, the adoption of a secondary currency skyrockets. And there's some different dynamics that go in there. It's basically a coordination game. Okay, or what we call the stag hunt game, which came up with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, is do you decide as a group to go after the big game, or are you concerned that people aren't going to coordinate, so you go off and hunt rabbit on your own, but then no one can go after the big game? It's the stag hunt coordination game. Are people willing to coordinate on using this money to their benefit or not? Okay, so what's the game actually look like? I got 3 different types of people. So in the game, I actually just say you hold a good. Here I'm using corn. You could have a red ticket, and this is all virtual on your computer screen, which is a primary currency. You offer that in exchange, and the person has to give you their goods. So it's a little bit of a cheat. Obviously, you don't have to accept US dollars, and just because they're legal tender, I can start up a store and only accept fidget spinners as money. Okay, legally, I do not have to, as a store owner in the United States, accept US dollars. It's only for paying taxes or legal debts. But I'm cheating with that and saying, well, people always accept US dollars, so why don't I just enforce that? Now, the blue tickets, people can choose whether or not to accept it in trade. So what's this look like? In the game, people are randomly matched up. You could be a good holder meeting another good holder. If you both like what the other person has, you can trade, okay? If a red ticket holder meets a good holder, likes their good, they trade the ticket, good holder has to give them the good. Now, if a blue ticket holder likes what the good holder has and say, please accept my ticket, the seller here can choose whether or not to accept it. This is the coordination game. So do you say, I'm going to accept that blue ticket because I think when I run into someone, I can buy their good? Okay, and the goal here is for the people playing the game to buy the good, then they, consume the good, and they earn points for that. And every time they earn a point, it goes towards 25 cents towards their payout for the subjects in the experiment. Okay, and I don't allow ticket-for-ticket trading. The reason for this, one, in the model, it doesn't make a difference as far as predictions. The second part is it simplifies the games. We want to keep the experiment for subjects very simple, a simple choice. The simpler the choice, the better as far as getting clean data results. Okay, so this is the required background on the experiment. So we ran it, or excuse me, I ran it at UC Santa Cruz and at here in the ARC lab at San José State. Each session, so we ran 8 sessions, we're actually at 10 sessions now, had 16 people playing the game. We've done 5 sessions for each treatment, okay, and we're gonna do up to 8 sessions, I believe. The average payout for people was $14. So I had undergraduates who come in, you get $7 guaranteed show-up fee, and people on average earn $14. They can make considerably more. So if you have students who want to make some money for weekend spending, have them sign up for the experimental lab. I want to pitch that a few times here. Okay, so in an experiment, there's approximately 100 trading rounds. It's randomly selected. We have to have it end, they can't know when it ends. Okay, they can have some idea it ends in about an hour, but if we tell them after 100 rounds, this stops. If you're in the 99th round, you're not going to accept the blue ticket because there is no 100th round. right? And then you get a degeneration on how people accept it. So we have to say there's a random chance it could stop, okay? And we tell them what that percent is. As part of this, we give them detailed instructions up front. They also take a quiz after they've read the instructions. And then they take part in about 4 practice rounds to get used to the interface. Okay, and a key part of economic experiments is there's no deception. So we don't say, oh, half of the people have a good, but we only give the good to 4 people. Or you can accept this in trade or not, and then it gets forced upon you. We have to set the rules up front, and those are the rules we follow. Everything is known to everyone. This is what the interface looks like. This is why you have to have a little bit of training up front, because it's a little confusing. But the key part is the top sort of row where it says, you have a blue ticket, your partner has a good, do you want to trade, yes or no? And that's the decision, okay? Keeps it very simple, very clean. They figure out, the participants figure out very quickly what their choice is. Okay. What am I at for time? 5 minutes, perfect. Okay, so what do the results look like? So this is for the barter treatment. Now, if you're looking at session 1, so that light bar is showing during the first 25 trading periods, what was the average acceptance rate of the blue ticket? And you can see across sessions about 40 to 50%. What happens after that? Significant drop off in 4 of the 5 sessions, meaning people are starting to see, hey, no one else is accepting this secondary currency, the blue ticket, I'm not going to accept it now. There's some learning process that's happening. Now, this becomes more apparent when you compare it to the situation where they aren't allowed to barter. Okay, secondary currency acceptance, blue ticket acceptance skyrockets. Okay, it's extremely drastic. I can tell when I don't have to know which treatment I'm doing. I can tell when students are getting angry that they must be in the barter treatment because no one's accepting their blue ticket, and you get stuck with it and you can't do anything. And you just see this frustration on their faces. They like the no barter treatment much better because there's a lot more trade going on. To look at 2 specific sessions. So this is a barter treatment session. So what this shows is all the different subjects. Okay, an orange triangle represents a time when they've rejected the secondary currency, and a blue circle is when they've accepted it. They've accepted that blue ticket when they're a seller. And you know, there's some subjects that occasionally are willing to accept that blue ticket, but it becomes very clear early on, people stop or start rejecting it, and that's that. And there's some people from the get-go. You look at subject 14 and 15, and pretty much subject 16, never accept this blue ticket. And the no barter treatment, it's drastically different. Again, the first 25 rounds or so, people are willing to test out the water, see what's happening. Will people accept this blue ticket or not? Maybe I shouldn't. But they quickly, what I think happens is they quickly realize if I don't trade with that blue ticket and I can't barter, my only option to ever trade and earn points and get money is to accept this blue ticket. Because otherwise, I only have this red ticket option that's being forced on me. Okay, so conclusions. The inability to barter appears to be a big driver behind why people are willing to accept these secondary currencies. Okay, and then I always hesitate to do this, but it's required in economics. You always go, what are your policy implications? I don't know, it's just a cool question. I like, money's interesting to look at. So. What I would come out of it is that a lack of government prohibition against these secondary currencies, or even like in the Greek situation where they supported these local community currencies, is beneficial. It helps increase economic activity. So as I said, I think the Greek government got it right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. Our last speaker is Dr. Wendy Rouse from Sociology and Interdisciplinary Social Sciences. Title of her presentation is Her Own Hero, The Origins of the Women's Self-Defense Movement from 1890 to 1920. So Dr. Rouse draws upon from her newly published book by the same title by New York University Press. And and talks about how at the turn of the 20th century, women famously organized to demand greater social and political freedoms, like gaining the right to vote. Hope you all voted yesterday, or before that. However, few realized that the progressive era also witnessed the birth of women's self-defense movement. And some women were inspired to take up boxing and jiu-jitsu for very personal reasons that range from protecting themselves from attacks by strangers on the street to rejecting gendered notions about feminine weakness and empowering themselves as their own protectors. So I'd like to invite Dr. Rouse to talk more about her research.
Thank you. That's it, though. You summed it up. I'm good. In 1905, Nellie Griffin was walking on her way home from work. She was a telephone operator in Oakland. And a man started to follow her. And of course, she was really scared. And he started to harass her verbally. And she kept telling him to leave her alone, but he wouldn't. So as she walked faster to try to get away from him, she started to think about all the things that people had told her. You know, that a woman's place was in the home, that she should avoid going out on the street in public. And if she did go out on the street, she should always have a protector with her, some male to protect her, her husband, a brother, an uncle, someone there to protect her. But she couldn't do that. She had to go to work and she had to get home from work. And in fact, she felt it was her right to be on the street. Well, as she continued walking, eventually he caught up with her, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. He actually grabbed her, and she turned around and she screamed, "Let go," but he wouldn't let go. So finally, she punched him square in the nose, and he started bleeding all over the place and screaming and crying. So she yelled for the police, and in all the commotion, a police officer finally came over and arrested him for assault. They ended up in the police station, and a reporter came up and was so incredulous that this small little petite woman would be capable of fighting back that he said, "What compelled you to do that?" And she said, "If you could be forced to stand the everlasting insults that a woman has, you would understand why I acted as I did tonight. I've waited too long for some bystander to take up the fight for me, but no one has ever volunteered. So I was compelled to assert my rights." So essentially what she's saying is, not only does she have the right and the ability to fight back, but that she doesn't need a protector. And this was a really radically empowering idea at that time. Now, women had been fighting for centuries for their political, economic, and social rights. And this was the era of the women's suffrage movement. So they were fighting for their right to vote, but they were fighting for much more than that. They were fighting for their right to walk down the street. They were fighting for their right to pursue an education, to pursue a career of their choice. And they were fighting for their right to live in loving and equal marriages. And they wanted to do all of this free from harassment and assault. Although I'm a historian by training, and I've spent my whole life studying martial arts and self-defense, I never thought about writing a history of women's self-defense. It just never occurred to me. We had been told that our parents and our teachers were the first generation of women to break into the male-dominated sports of martial arts. So I didn't think that there was very much of a history to it. I thought the 60s and 70s, that was kind of the time period that women started training in self-defense. So I was researching my dissertation, which was on a totally different topic. It was on immigration at the turn of the century. And as I was going through the old newspaper articles, I came across this image, which would become the cover of the book. And this image really surprised me because it totally shattered everything that I thought I knew about the history of women's self-defense. This was over 100 years before I thought that women were really studying martial arts. So when I looked at this, I was shocked because it's the same techniques. If any of you have ever taken a self-defense class, you know that the palm heel strike is a very common technique that they teach beginners. So this was the same techniques that we teach in self-defense classes today. And I've had the opportunity to do a lot of talks on this at women's martial arts associations, and people are always like, there's this aha moment where everyone's like, oh, because this is the same techniques that we teach now. And I just was so curious about this that I clipped it, and I continued to do it. I totally rejected my current research and started researching this instead, so there was a little bit of a delay. And I found as many articles as I could to try to understand what was happening. And what I found is in this period, in this pre-1920 period, there was this clear self-defense movement that emerged, and it paralleled the first wave of the women's rights movement. So if we look at the different time periods of the women's rights movement, the self-defense movement kind of went along with that. So one of my first questions then was, what types of martial arts were women studying, and how did they come about studying them? And what I found is that it was quite complicated, much more than I thought. First, you have to know that around the turn of the century, there was this huge athletic movement, a physical culture movement where people were really concerned about their physical well-being, their health and safety. And so people increasingly began to try all different types of sports and techniques and athletics. And boxing was typically a working class activity, but more and more middle class men were taking up boxing as sport. And they saw it as a manly art, a way to improve not only their physique, but their character as well. But there was a new generation of college-educated women who were also getting involved in athletics and in physical culture, and they saw this as an opportunity to also get in shape, but to learn some techniques to defend themselves. So they literally showed up at boxing gyms and started asking for instruction. And the boxing instructors were more than happy to take their money and to show them a few techniques. And it ended up becoming quite a trend. In fact, even young girls sometimes took boxing classes. You laugh now, but wait till she gets it. There you go. She's really good. Okay, so besides boxing, people also started studying jiu-jitsu. And part of this was because there was this fascination with all things Japanese and American culture at the time. Japan had recently defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, and Teddy Roosevelt, who was president at the time, was super interested in the history of Japan and martial arts. He was a boxer himself, so he loved martial culture. And he was curious about this jiu-jitsu that he had heard so much about. So he actually invited jiu-jitsu instructors to the White House, and they showed him techniques, and he started practicing it himself. And there's letters, and I've read through his letters talking to his sons about all the techniques that he was learning and how he was sore and bruised, but he loved it, and he couldn't wait for them to try it and things like that. But he was curious, and he learned as much as he could, and eventually he loved it so much that he said the American military should adopt it. So he recommended that the military academy hire his instructor, and they started teaching it in the US military academies, especially up into World War I. And it became pretty much mainstream part of the military. So this endorsement allowed a lot of middle-class men and women to take up jiu-jitsu. And in fact, women started to see this as another opportunity to kind of make a point about the equality between men and women. So there was a group of Washington women who actually hated Teddy Roosevelt and all of his posturing all the time and everything. And so what they did is they hired his instructor's wife to teach them. She was a highly ranked jiu-jitsu instructor herself, Fude Yamashita, and they asked her to teach them some techniques, and they did it very publicly. They had the classes out on the White House lawn, and they invited the press to come and report on it and to show what they were doing. And they even brought their daughters there to take classes with the jiu-jitsu instructors. And essentially what they were saying is that men and women are equal, and they used this as a political symbolism to challenge kind of the gender inequality at the time. Okay, so the average woman, though, obviously could not afford necessarily to take these formal classes with these top-ranked instructors. But many women were interested because of the harassment that they faced on the street. So the number one thing that drove women into these self-defense classes was street harassment. Previously, there was this whole concept of separate spheres, that a woman's place was in the home and a man's place was in the public sphere. But women more and more were challenging that. That whole concept was completely shattering by the early 20th century. And women were out in public space, they were going to work, they were in factories, they were working in shops, they were working and shopping in the city center. So more and more women were on the streets. But they faced a lot of backlash to this. And a lot of people saying that this wasn't really the place for them. So a common word at the time was this phrase called the masher. And the masher was this slang term, we should just bring it back, that describes a man who harassed a woman on the street. So sexual or physical or verbal harassment on the street. And women complained about these mashers, and they complained about harassment in what's basically the hashtag #MeToo moment of the early 20th century. They started talking very loudly about this being a problem. They started writing into columnists, mostly female journalists who were writing in the paper, then would publish their complaints. They started talking about what a pest and what a problem and what a danger in some cases this situation was. So people responded with the usual comments you can imagine. If they had comment sections on the papers back then, it would have been really interesting. But people said and responded to them and said, basically, well, you shouldn't be out on the street. Go back home. What are you doing? Other people said, well, maybe you should bring someone with you to protect you. Your husband should go with you if you're out on the street. And other people said, well, maybe it doesn't even exist. Like, you're making this up. Another common reaction was to just say that they were asking for it, that it was the way that they were dressed, the way that they were walking, the way that they were looking at men, that they were causing this and bringing it upon themselves. But again, women refused to be silent. They kept bringing it up. It was a big issue. It was in all the newspapers at the time. And like I said, it was mostly in these female journalists who were raising this issue. And they insisted that something be done. So the courts and the police eventually passed more laws against this and started regulating it and started arresting people. But the police couldn't be everywhere at once. Women couldn't always look to the police for protection, obviously, either. So they eventually started to take the issue into their own hands, and there was this whole Smash the Masher crusade, where people were saying, you need to speak out, you need to fight back, you need to do what you have to do because people are not going to protect you, you have to protect yourself. And jiu-jitsu instructors jumped in on this, and they're like, hey, come to our classes, we can teach you how to be safe from attack, and especially on the streets. And so this kind of image of this sinister stranger emerges, and women are encouraged to sign up for self-defense classes to learn to defend themselves. So even boxing instructors, because you saw this guy before, he was a boxer, they learned jiu-jitsu because they saw that there was this demand for it, and then they started teaching women techniques. So this is also the emergence of the first mixed martial arts, by the way, in case you're interested in that, because literally they realized they had to know a little bit of everything. So obviously not everyone could afford to take classes, and then she knees him. So the newspapers also publish tutorials, what to do, how to defend yourself. These are really popular now on Pinterest, these little images you'll see circulating the internet. But they were originally like meant to be how-to, things like this, when a thug attacks you. So gradually this is challenging that narrative of female frailty and weakness. Another reason that women took up self-defense training was for explicitly political reasons. So this is best illustrated, I think, by the suffragettes in England, because they were taking this up as part of their political movement. So women were fighting for the right to vote in England, and they were facing quite a bit of physical assaults from literally people who would come to heckle them when they were giving their speeches or protesting. They were pushed, they were shoved to the ground, they had rotten fruit thrown at them, urine-soaked rags. It was quite violent. And when they appealed to the police for protection, they found the police were just as brutal back to them. And in fact, police brutality was one of their #1 complaints. When they were arrested for some of their more militant actions, like chaining themselves to fences, the police would literally beat them in the process of arresting them. So eventually, a very kind jiu-jitsu instructor offered to teach them. Her name was Edith Garud, and she was very skilled in jiu-jitsu. So she actually started advertising her classes to the suffragettes in their newspaper. So it says, jiu-jitsu for suffragette self-defense. And she literally taught them how to defend themselves against the police, which of course upset the police. And they started to mock them in the press, saying, what are you gonna do? And also the press sometimes mocked the police, saying, what are you gonna do? Because they know self-defense now. And so it became this kind of mockery of the suffragettes in general. And they were depicted as masculinized freaks who, for the most part, wanted to be men, according to the critics at the time, and that they were dangerous. And so in some of the propaganda, it was shifted, so they were the ones that became violent instead of the anti-suffragists or the police. So all of this public discussion about jiu-jitsu and boxing and about street harassment and about assaults against suffragists really provided an opportunity for feminists and women's rights activists to dispel the real myths surrounding violence against women. There was this tendency to focus on the stranger danger. There was a tendency to focus on deflecting blame on this non-white other. So black men were depicted as rapists, Asian men were depicted as sexual predators, and Southern and Eastern European immigrants were often depicted as sex traffickers. Women, of course, white women, were depicted as their innocent victims and their bodies as especially subject to these foreign invaders. And all of this was fueled by the racism and xenophobia at the time. But a few prominent feminist activists pointed out the radical truth that the real violence, the real threat against women was actually in the home, by the men that they loved. So white women were most at risk by white men. But this was a pretty radical thing to say then, and especially even now, right? People don't want to talk about that. But I thought that I always was aware of the statistics, and I was aware of this conversation that was happening beneath the surface. In fact, this is a play by the suffragettes, and they would do plays about jujitsu so they can demonstrate the techniques. And in this particular play, a man comes home and he often beats his wife, and then she ends up learning self-defense to protect herself, and she ends up subduing him, and he promises to be good and to never beat her again. It's a comedy, and it's supposed to be enjoyed and laughed at and everything, but you can see they're obviously dealing with the themes of violence against women. What I noticed is that the newspaper articles at the time printed horrific headlines about women being murdered in the streets. And this, of course, resulted in these loud public demands that the police crack down and that they do something, and that women beware and be careful on the streets. But in Chicago, between 1904 and 1905, there was 24 women killed on the streets, and the newspaper was just going crazy, saying, it's not safe, women beware, some sinister stranger is going to jump out of the bushes and attack and kill you, so please, please, please be careful, or in fact, just go back home, whatever you've got to do, but this is so dangerous. But I was curious, because I know all the statistics, right, about violence against women. So I went back and I clipped every single article about these women being killed, and I went to the coroner's records and everything else. And in fact, I went ahead and backed up 5 years leading up to this just to take a look at it. And what I found was that there were 99 women murdered between the years 1900 and 1904, and 85% were killed by men that they knew. 67% were killed at home or at work. And honestly, these statistics are much higher because there were several that I could not even identify who killed them or where, so I imagine that they're much higher. So the reality was that women were indeed most at risk from violence in their own homes. And of course, like I said, radical feminists knew this, and radical suffragists were bringing this up. Perhaps my favorite quote is from Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who said, there's this popular masculine myth that assumes that man is woman's natural protector, but in fact, he's often the worst danger she can hope to meet. And I think this kind of summed up the idea that many feminists were raising, is that man is not woman's natural protector, and she needs to do what she can. So Gilman actually wrote a couple of pieces of fiction where young girls learn boxing and jujitsu and end up being able to fight back and protect themselves. She was an advocate of that as well. So women's self-defense was really this radically empowering idea. And you would see a kind of a decline in the movement that would emerge again in the 60s and 70s. So most of us are probably aware of that second wave feminism and the physical empowerment of women and the Take Back the Night and all of the self-defense classes that emerged during this time. And it was this second wave, the second generation of self-defense advocates that really started these larger conversations about violence and the sources of violence against women. And they tried to dispel those myths about the dangerous stranger, the mysterious, sinister stranger on the streets, and to try to do more for violence against women. And they started to challenge harmful gender stereotypes and to challenge the pervasive rape culture. And we saw that again a little bit in the 90s with girl power. Some people call this the third wave, the 1990s. And today, there is still this movement of what we call feminist self-defense. There's a model called empowerment self-defense, and it has its roots directly in the 60s and 70s, although I've been telling all the instructors that are the ESD instructors that it actually has its roots in the early 20th century to challenge their notion. But these instructors are very rare. You don't find very many of them around. They're actually certified by a national organization. And the emphasis is, yes, on the physical techniques of protecting yourself, but also on the psychological techniques. Thinking about gender socialization and violence, and dealing with the larger issues in rape culture with sexism, racism, and classism, but ultimately holding the perpetrator responsible. And again, there's not very many of these, and your average self-defense class is not empowerment self-defense. And I have lots of complaints about those, but I won't talk about it right now. So we're talking about a very unique model, but it does still exist, and it has roots in those feminist movements from the previous eras. So I'd like to leave you with just my favorite video from the time, because she's really good. And this is usually causes roaring applause among when I show this to self-defense instructors. So self-defense training really emerged in the 20th century as a way for women to powerfully claim their bodies as their own. They were loudly and boldly shouting, "Enough is enough," and they were asserting their humanity by physically and politically empowering themselves. You could watch this all day. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. This was really great, all the 4 presentations. So one more round of applause for all the 4 presenters. So next, for the next 20 minutes or so, we will take questions and discussion and comments. So I'll request all the 4 presenters to come. I'll pull up these tables, and then for the audience, you can raise your hands, and I'll come with the microphone to you.
But I wanted to make sure to thank all the presenters today. It was really great. I have a question about the no barter versus barter component of the study, because that's obviously sort of an interesting constraint on the trade options. So why would barter not be an option, and where the situations where no barter does emerge? My sort of uneducated guess on this would be that no barter would be for trade that would happen over longer distances, and that barter would happen in more local communities where trust is more established, but I'd be curious if you know anything about that.
Well, it sort of depends if you're looking historically or not. So yes, historically, what we typically would see, you go back, Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago, you have local gift economies, and then long distance trade money arises. More recently, if we're looking at Greece or even Venezuela, what it is that there's specialization. So it's much more difficult. If I make nails and you build cars, it's pretty hard for us to come together for a trade.
I'll try not to be greedy and only ask one question. Mary, I was wondering about, there's this, this is not my background, but I was wondering about sort of a psychological component, and that is student development over time and their ability to synthesize information. And I wondered if, and you may not have enough data points to be able to do this, but the idea of whether or not you could separate out taking the methods class simply before the capstone course versus could you parse out them taking it very early versus sort of intermediate, and trying to get at sort of maybe some kind of synthetic event that's taking place, and could they even, as long as they take it before the capstone, do better, but the closer in time, even better. And maybe then the comparison between the capstone versus the other upper division classes may be interesting in terms of that.
So it's actually something I do want to look at. So is it just the methods class, how close to the senior seminar, and are there other classes in between? I have a number of colleagues where we emphasize research methods. So I want to know, does the research methods class help them with those other topical classes, but do those topical classes also help them in the senior seminar? Because we're emphasizing research methods in those courses. So I do want to look at that. My concern is I don't have enough data to look at that. So now that this has become something I'm really passionate about, I do want to continue to collect data on this. And Scott Heil, which I didn't have a chance to mention, he has been enormously helpful. They have tons of data at IEA. If you guys don't know, IEA is a great source to get student data. So yeah, I mean, for instance, in my political participation class, we emphasize research methods. I know Melinda teaches a lot of classes where she emphasizes research methods. So yes, I think there is something there. I can't test it now, but I do want to collect more data where I can test it. My research method students have questions. I'm so excited.
Actually, just to follow, oh, that's loud. I don't think I need this because I have a very loud voice, but we have a similar, we teach research methods in my department as well in our sociology program. And we have this ongoing question of what they should take first, whether it's theory, methods, or writing, and we have actually required that they take research methods, but we have 2 methods classes, a qualitative and a quantitative, and to take them in their junior year, if they take them before their capstone, then they're taking them at the same time. And it has created a bit of a bottleneck, and now we're actually trying to get rid of that. And a lot of it made it harder to get through our program, and then all the athletes seemed to go to comm. Are there any comm people in here? But we used to get, our program was seen as an easier program to get through, but once we actually implemented this, and it's a little bit harder. But I do think it's an interesting question, because which of those, because you kind of need all of them for each other. Like, you want to have good writing if you're in a research methods class, you want theory before you're, so I appreciate your study. I mean, I think it's not unique to your department. I mean, obviously it's an issue probably for a lot of the departments in our college, so.
Yeah, that's something we've been talking about. So we do require 100 our writing class before the senior seminar, and now if we're having a conversation about requiring research methods before the capstone course, are we going to create a bottleneck for our students, especially when, they have complicated lives, they all work, they have family obligations, everything else. One of the things the department is doing is offering more research methods, at least 2 per semester. So that will help ease the bottleneck. The encouraging thing is that over 80% of them right now, without the prerequisite, are taking it before. So whatever we can do to ease that bottleneck will help. But as the 6 of them who are here today, they can tell you it's hard to get into the class. Typically, when we teach it, we have multiple people trying to crash the class, and there just are not spaces. And we try to keep the class at a reasonable size, because it's a class that's really intensive. I mean, you want to be able to provide them a lot of one-on-one time. And if the class has 45 students, you just cannot provide a good learning environment for them. So it's something I'm passionate about, but I'm also realistic about.
Hi, Dr. Rouse. I really appreciated your presentation, and I wanted to know your thoughts on how you think the women's self-defense movement has changed with the increase in technology. In my own experience, I get a lot of ads for like nail polish that's like, able to detect when like a date rape drug has been like placed like in your drink, or there's even a new one now where there's like a bracelet that you wear as jewelry that you can like press the button to get out of an awkward situation. And to me, that just shows that women's self-defense is shifting from like physical to more that gray area of where you're not like in immediate danger, but it's still a form of self-defense. Why do you think that it has changed, or what are your thoughts on that shift from more like martial arts, like self-defense, to technology?
That's a long conversation.
I know. I'm sorry. Thank you, though.
No, it's good. I have to turn off my self-defense instructor brain, or should I leave it on? I'll leave it on. So usually there's an emphasis on not relying on outside techniques or tools to protect you. So I think that does go back to the whole thing of like relying on something else to think for you or to protect you. So a lot of self-defense instructors have always like said that just, the mace, the things like that, they're marketing ploys to get you to buy something so you feel safer, but they're continuing that trend of you have to depend on something else or someone else, instead of focusing on some of the larger issues that teach you to be more aware, or using your own internal warning signs to recognize danger and to kind of get yourself out of that situation. So as a self-defense instructor, the thing is, don't rely on technology or don't rely on tools. They've always been around, and they're part of the marketing thing of you're too weak to protect yourself, so use this mace, or you're too weak to do something, so pull this or push this button on your phone, and then the police will come and save you. So it's all part of that kind of marketing of fear for women. So I don't like it.
I have a question, and forgive me if I leave after a couple minutes because I have a class at 1:30. Wendy, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the process of your research. You said you were flipping through a magazine or something and you saw that ad and it totally set you off on this new path. How do you go about finding these ads over the course of 100 years? And is there a repository? Is there something online we can look at? I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you conduct that research.
Well, it was one of the weirdest projects because it was very hard to find the information. But newspapers.com is mostly what I use. And I had to think of all the different ways, all the different search terms to try to come up with these articles. And then if I would find individuals, I would research individuals, literally doing genealogical research through ancestry.com. And then I would try to get as much information as I could. And I wanted to do more traditional archival research, but unfortunately, it was so hard to find. But every once in a while, in researching an individual, I would be able to locate some sort of document associated with it. So the girls that were studying on the White House lawn, I found that photo and I went through all the names, and then I found a few that had archival collections, and then I went and looked at their archival collection. I found one letter describing what it was like to take these jiu-jitsu classes. So it was just like pulling out these little threads until eventually you had the whole story.
Oh, okay, thank you. So I did want to make one comment in my role as department chair, which was with regard to Mary's project, which is great because now as we're having these conversations in our department, we actually have some data, which is nice. But one of the things we realized in terms of students sometimes delaying taking the methods class is that the number assigned to the class was 195, which is the highest number. It's higher than 190, which is our senior seminar. And so we just put in the catalog change to actually change the course number to 100M, which we think sends the message that you've got 100W for writing and you've got 100M for methods. So it took us a while to figure that out, but we're hoping that that will also help as well. But I actually had a question for Gordon. I thought it was really fascinating to learn about this DIY urban movement that I've now realized that I see all over the place, but I didn't know it was a thing and had a name and all of that. And I appreciate the critical perspective that you bring to it. I found myself wondering, and of course, I think the recommendations of involving community members in a meaningful way is important. I found myself wondering, however, is there possibly a positive effect of having these privileged middle class, activists doing their thing and not getting arrested? Or punished because of their position of privilege in society. But does that possibly then kind of open the door to allowing more of that activity to occur from maybe broader, more diverse segments of the community?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think the answer is yes, probably on two different levels. One of which is that literally if the first step is maybe taken by somebody who feels entitled and privileged, that might be from a broad perspective problematic, right? Because it's just simply this sort of acting on privilege. But right, as you said, it could be opening the door for more people to do it. I think actually I showed a picture of this Buddhist shrine that is yeah, exactly, near where both Walt and I live, in Oakland, where that was started by that what is now a huge shrine and real kind of cultural institution in this neighborhood, that every day has people worshiping at it, mainly from the local Vietnamese community. The first step toward that was one of our neighbors, an older white guy, who got a statue of the Buddha at Ace Hardware and epoxied it to a rock in that street median that had been a site for dumping and drug use and loitering and what have you. And so you could argue that he had this kind of privilege too, to be like, well, I'm just going to put this here. Now anybody could have epoxied that Buddha to a rock. It wasn't exactly a big problem. But that did, I think, to some extent enable then the local Vietnamese community to feel more comfortable embracing this thing, using that site, and then all of I wish I had the picture up or had pointed it out while it was up, but it is now a huge multi-part structure with lights and music and all this stuff, and it's all totally DIY and unauthorized. And I think you could argue that his privilege did kind of maybe open that door for something that people without a lot of English skills, without a lot of resources, might not have felt comfortable doing by themselves. And then there's a larger question of
policy adapting, right? And so there are new policies in cities, including Oakland, but certainly Los Angeles, San Francisco, elsewhere, to try to create more opportunity for people to do these kinds of things, still from a bottom-up, grassroots, DIY way, but with some more formal approval. And I think that that's exactly what has to happen if people who don't operate with that social privilege in public space are going to be able to feel comfortable taking part in these kinds of things. So there's actually, I think, a kind of imperative for good old-fashioned policy and regulation and whatever, all the stuff that DIY kind of flies in the face of, to try to find a way to bring it above ground enough that anybody could feel comfortable doing it, not just somebody who's super comfortable talking their way out of a interaction with a police officer at 3 a.m.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Gordon, I have a quick question for you as well. I was in your research, did you, in interviewing people, I'm curious about what their relationship is with local government. How do these projects start? Sometimes have an idea and they go to their public officials and they get turned down? These are often, sounds like what you're describing, people would normally have a fairly, robust interaction with local government. So I was curious if you speak to that.
Yeah, so this is part of it, and something I talk a lot about in the book is that these are folks with, and privilege isn't just your relationship to police or something like that, or how you're perceived on the streets, right? It's literally like political capital in this stuff. And a lot of the people I talk to have relatively high amounts of political capital. Their city councilmen might listen to them about various issues, right? I talk to pastors at churches and people who literally work in city government, right? One of the guys making these DIY bike lanes worked for the city department of transportation doing bike stuff, but they couldn't get it. He's frustrated that it wasn't getting built quickly enough or whatever, but he knew exactly what he was doing, so he was with his buddies at night painting bike lanes. So these interactions are really complicated, and again, I think are fairly fraught with kind of privilege and inequality. But just to give a couple other examples, I think that a lot of the people I talked to were frustrated by authorities not kind of responding to what they wanted, whether that was in the abstract, there's an existing bike plan, but it's a 40-year bike plan and it's not happening. Or very specifically, one of the guys I interviewed who did a much more, I didn't take the time in this short talk to talk about the real kind of stuff that really pushes the limits of what is good and bad about this stuff. But I interviewed a guy who removed a bus stop from outside of his house and thought of that as DIY placemaking, right? He called it DIY planning. And he did it because the garbage was piling up and the city wasn't picking up the garbage at the bus stop, and he had emailed and called and tried every formal channel that he could, and was so frustrated that he went out and removed the bus stop, right? So that was a direct, problem with authority not kind of listening to him or whatever. So I guess it goes in all directions. I could think of countless other examples, but I'll stop. Thank you.
Maybe time for one last comment or question.
For Dr. Douglas, for your speech on how all of this DIY development kind of leans more into that neoliberalism kind of side, where it's all of these, people are taking it on themselves, and then we're kind of losing the whole, we're losing the whole institution kind of that would be establishing that. It was so interesting to kind of hear that side of it, because I come from the city of Santa Monica, which is the hometown, I think, of gentrification. It's got a ton of those types of developments. That's what they're all about. And it's so interesting because a lot of us there, it's a lot of me and my friends would totally think of taking something on like that ourselves. And absolutely, if a cop comes to, bring something up to us, we'll just tell them what we're doing and they'll understand. And it was just so interesting because it was really eye-opening to see in these places where it's not, where they don't have such a high income level and where it's not so prioritized to make the aesthetic of the city better. It was just really interesting to kind of understand that you can really be having those intrusive gentrifying effects on these longstanding cities. Very interesting. Thank you.
So I wasn't going to make a comment on DIY, but since you brought it up. So I've taken on a couple of DIY projects myself in South County. So there's a series of murals that were painted during the Chicano movement of the 1960s, and ironically in a city that's 60% Latino. Gilroy, California, 51,000 people, 58% Latino, so majority Latino. So all these murals that were all over, parks and buildings that were painted by the Latino community back in the early 1970s, the city never maintained, so they were falling apart. So we, the Latino community, just kind of got tired of it, and we're like, we pay a lot of taxes. We're mostly homeowners. A lot of people never consider that we could be homeowners too. And so we just started taking on the projects, and we've completed 2 of them. We went to the school and we're like, hey, we demand that you let us repaint this mural because it's fading. It's really representative of our culture. It's a beautiful, and we even know the artist, so we were able to reach out to the original artist, bring up some artists from San Diego, and then convince the city to give us money to pay for the materials and pay for the artists and redo them. So we're in the process right now of, there was 3 or 4 of them done, so we're at our 4th mural, and it was DIY. It was just using our social capital, our political capital, and saying, bringing up the monster of racism and saying, look, we know that you're not repainting these murals because they're Latino murals, and they kind of signify and represent and are iconic for our community. They represent our home, and you don't want to spend our tax dollars on us again. So, yeah, that was just a comment that we're doing it not too far from here. You don't have to go to Oakland. You can stay in Santa Clara County and find DIY.
Oh, yeah. No, I have examples from San Jose in there too. And I agree, and I think this is what's so crucial about this. So a lot of this stuff I think is really great. Even some of the really trendy, cutesy stuff that gets built, a lot of it is great. It's making our streets better, safer, more walkable, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth is that because of who is able to do this with more privilege and what have you, and the way that it gets kind of elevated by authority and elevated by just like the press, Streets blog, and these places that kind of like celebrate stuff, right? Means that a lot of the time it's happening not in the places where it's most needed, right? Like where the authorities are not keeping up their end of the bargain by repainting these murals or whatever. Simple stuff, like I interviewed folks who just like fix playground, busted swings and things like that, right? And there's a real need for that. But where most of it's happening is actually the place where it can do the most damage, which are these like areas that are right on the edge where there's rapid displacement, growing inequality, cultural change, right? Where this kind of stuff that might still in the abstract be kind of like, oh, cool, a positive, nice, somebody's spending the time to do this, fix this thing. That's where it becomes really problematic and has these greater implications for kind of neighborhood change and who's welcome and who's not, and whose ideals are visible in public space. So yeah, I agree, and good for you guys.
Thank you. Maybe no. Thank you. So now, first, thank you so much for all the presenters and for a lovely discussion. Sorry. A question for Justin? Okay.
So I just have a quick question for Justin, because I have so many research method students here that I would love for you to talk a little bit about your recruiting for your experiment. And there's a concern about using students in experiments and about, validity and generalization and these types of things. And if you wouldn't mind just quickly speaking to that.
Yeah, so validity is one of the, it has been a big concern, but there's actually been research done on research, as you do. And we found that whether we use professionals or high school students or graduate students, that the results are more or less the same. There's some times where contextual differences do play a role, but in general, when it's, do I accept this currency or not, and I make 25 cents every time I do, it's pretty consistent across the board. As far as recruiting subjects, that's been a painful process that Colleen is currently helping out with as I speak. We have about 325 subjects signed up. We can't do it with offering extra credit. That's just standard experimental economic protocol. It's been guerrilla marketing. So going out and posting flyers in different places with the little tags on them and very big sign that says, play games, get money. So that's really been the gist of what we've done. So.
Thank you, thank you. So before we end, a round of thanks to several folks who made this event happen. First, I'd like to thank the Dean's Office staff, Venetia Johnson sitting right at the back. Thank you, Venetia, so much. Also, student assistants, Brett and Shadab, thank you so much, guys. And photography, Robert Bain, right here. Thank you, Robert. For the video, Keith Sanders, right there, and standing there, and his two assistants, Priyatam and Louis. Thank you so much. So with that, we come to an end of this session. Thank you.